Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for the second talk as part of Hyperfunctional Ultra Healthy, a series for Somerset House Studios, which sees contributions from individuals within the arts and sciences to explore and unpack notions of contemporary health and well-being. Today we're lucky to be joined by Nella Aarne. Nella will be presenting her lecture notes on our collective cosmoecological body, asking what it means to practice care and to affirm life as part of one collective body. Just before we dive in, a little bit about Nella. Nella Aarne is a curator living and working in southwest England. She is the co-director of Obsidian Coast with artist Sam Smith and the convener of the Animacy Reading Group, envisaging feminist and environmentally sustainable practices. Her work considers ethical encounters, collaborative learning, and redefined notions of productivity. Hey Nella, how you been? You good?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for
pleasure. Just before we jump in and we hand over, just to say to the audience, people watching, if you do have any questions for Nella, please do drop them into the chat during the presentation, and we'll try and come to them at the end. But yeah, over to you, Nella.
Cool. So hi everyone. Thanks for joining me today. It's lovely that you're here, even if I can't see you, but I trust that you're with me. So before getting into what's going to be a very organic unfolding of thoughts on interdependence and modes of sociality, care, and conflict, I wanted to share how I've arrived at this particular unfolding. So as you already kind of kindly introduced, so I work as a curator, and at the moment my curatorial activities primarily revolve around co-directing Obsidian Coast and trying to envision these sustainable, in all senses of the word, feminist practices. And when I'm thinking about curatorial work and life at large, I'm often kind of in this rabbit hole thinking about how one could best operate from within one's specific social, political, and material position in this chaotic web of the world, and do it cautiously. And by this web of the world, I mean the kind of interrelations between and within also different social, political, and cultural contexts amongst humans, as well as more than human ecologies and our material reality in general terms. And I wonder what kind of curatorial practice would provide hospitable conditions for the practicing self, the practicing others, and gathering publics, whilst also being sensitive and considerate towards the worlds that might be implicated in my actions, even if I didn't necessarily recognize my own connection to them. And because of these questions that I had about the very felt but sometimes indecipherable kind of layer and this rationality that extends all the way into the cosmos, in 2017 I started the Animacy Reading Group, which you also kindly mentioned. And I wanted to learn more about scholarly work within and around the crossovers of feminist theory and post-humanism, new materialism, and environmental humanities. And speaking of relationality, I wanted to do this in the company of others. And the idea was to think through feminist writings that look specifically at human and non-human agents in the material world in these free-flowing discussions at monthly meetings that would be open to all. And that's what Of Animacy became. So until early 2020, the gatherings were held at the ICA in London. And last summer, I also hosted a series of online meetings at Kim Contemporary Art Center in Riga with curator Erik Martinsen. And so when I was invited to do a talk that would contextualize artistic practices and critical thought in relation to the planetary ecological decline, I wanted to take this as an opportunity to reflect back on Of Animacy Reading Group and all the things I've learned through that activity. So in what follows, I'll introduce ideas that have become important to me over these years of conversations with all intelligent and kind people who've generously shared their knowledge along the way. And although my explorations will be primarily theoretical, I'll also mention projects to be informative to my thinking, not only as a curator, but as a living being. And at the crux of all of this is the idea, I think, that the lines of inquiry opened up in scholarly fields like feminist new materialism or post-humanism must be considered in parallel with anti-colonial critique. And as a final note, so I used to describe of Animacy Reading Group as follows. The readings and discussions meander through a multiplicity of concepts and ways of thinking, building a vibrant web of ideas, the shape and character of which organically unfolds over time. So I'm now, for the first time, trying to get a sense of what this web is forming into. So let's find out. So I borrowed the term cosmoecology from an essay called Cosmoecological Sheep and the Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet by Vincent Desprez and Michel Muret. They write, bodies, souls, pastures, steeps, cosmos, humans, sheep, dogs, horses, gazelles, and wolves are entangled in a net that connects the sky and the earth. Ecology and cosmology are knotted in a common story, forming a cosmoecology of multiple beings, gods, animals, humans, living and dead, each bearing the consequences of the other's ways of living and dying. Now, although the array of beings here refers to specific cattle farming practices in northern Mongolia, which the essay opens with, and a culturally specific tradition of viewing wolves as the intercessors between humans and gods, specifically allowing humans access to the afterlife, I think it encapsulates really beautifully how we all belong to a common matter. And this common matter constitutes an infinite array of separate, overlapping worlds where everything acts in relation to boundless other beings. So humans, other than humans, forms of life and non-life, and anything and everything that enables or obligates one to act. So whenever we do act, it doesn't only concern ourselves, but it also concerns these boundless others. And interrelation and codependency are therefore not something that we can choose for ourselves or opt out of, but rather our continuous state of affecting and being affected is the fundamental condition of existence. And it's this condition, I think, that makes the common matter a collective body, which must be treated with care. And we're now living in a time of steep ecological decline and mass extinction. And with these notes, I want to think through how and why we got here and some of the predicaments that we are now facing and trying to learn, as Desprez and Muret put it, the arts of living on a damaged planet. And to me, it feels impossible to do this without considering the legacy of carelessness that was sedimented by white supremacist colonial capitalism and the Western idea of human exceptionalism, which again is rooted in a very particular white supremacist and patriarchal notion of the human. As Astrida Neymanis has pointed out, it's necessary for colonizer societies to understand how the two modes of violence towards peoples and towards land and more than human ecologies are, whilst entirely distinct, they're intimately interlinked and both part of the master model of colonial domination. And at the same time, however, it feels essential to look for antidotes to this legacy of carelessness that has been built with violence. And I've tried to find these antidotes in scholarly writings and artistic practices that are three possible things. So the first one, conjuring futures that may, in the light of the history of our present, feel unimaginable at the moment, or looking for ways to attune the different modes and manifestations of modern human sociality, or trying to develop life-affirming practices of care. And on this idea of practicing care, so the human aspiration to practice care is, of course, easier said than done. When speaking of ecologies, life affirming to one can often be fatal to another. and we're literally dealing with questions of life and death. Hence, in the context of considering more than human worlds, I find myself asking again and again, who can assume the authority to decide which lives are to be cared for, how and by whom, and who can assume the role of a custodian or a spokesperson for someone with whom we don't share a language if we can't ask for their consent? And how can we try to care for boundless others whose experiences of the world are entirely unknown to us, when all the needs and wants of these others may not only be indecipherable to us in the first place, but also in conflict with one another and with the wants and needs of our own? So that's where we're at. And now I'm going to start with worlds that are ending. In Empty Metal, filmed by Adam Khalil and Bailey Swizer, a Rastafarian hacker, a monk, and an indigenous mother with a daughter, they lead an invisible insurrection in a speculative near future of the US, portrayed here as a hostile police state, which is perhaps not so far from the present. Actually, these characters are more like active spirits passing through time via different corporeal containers to instigate rebellion. And as part of this insurrection, they recruit a noise band called Alien to assassinate 3 white police officers who have got away with murder. And one of the indigenous protagonists says, "The word apocalypse literally means an uncovering or disclosure of knowledge, usually something hidden, a vision of heavenly secrets that can make sense of earthly realities. The end of the world, on the other hand, is a matter of perspective. Most people think the end of the world is going to come for everyone at the same time. For us, the end of the world happened a long time ago." And I bring up this film not only because I think it's an essential point in itself that there are many worlds that end at different times, but also because this film raises many other essential points through questions and provocations. And I'll return to this film at the very, very end. But now let's move on. So we know that worlds are ending, and many worlds have already ended because one particular world has exhausted and trampled over so many others. For hundreds of years, the regime of white supremacist colonial capitalism has continued endless extraction, destruction, and violence for the gain of white Europeans, all justified by rhetorics of salvation and reason. And in her essay, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, Freedom, Sylvia Wynter traces the history of Western humanism and articulates how classical, medieval Judeo-Christian, Renaissance, and Enlightenment era descriptors have been harnessed of what it means to be human. They've been harnessed systematically by Western thought to establish human as interchangeable with man and as exclusively applicable to white Europeans. And this essay is really long and brilliant, and I'm still kind of lost in it, and I'm not able to summarize it or ever do it justice, really, but I'll say what I can. So navigating through the class and gender hierarchies of the ancient Greek polis and the Christian fixation on the spiritual transcendence and salvation, and the emergence of physical sciences from the Renaissance onwards, Wynter is unearthing a conflation of religious and secular attributes that have come to constitute the West's self-description as the sole holder of power, truth, and freedom. And to summarize this religious come secular origin story, as Wynter kind of lays it out, the human of the Western humanism, also known as the man with a capital M, was created in the image of God, and consequently the man was positioned as an agent of God and was seen to have God's mandate to oversee and categorize and utilize everything on earth for his benefit, whilst continuously aspiring towards pious spirituality and away from lowly corporeal passions and impulses of the earthly domain, in other words, sin. So following this gradual secularization of Western societies that happened through the emergence of physical sciences, it became then man's reason, a new path to transcendence in a place of holiness, but still reminiscent of holiness, that would distinguish man from other life on Earth and protect man's humanity from the disorderly, unpredictable, and irrational aspects of life on Earth. And at the same time, man became understood primarily as a political subject in relation to the state, not only as a servant of God connected to the church. Hence, in the place of seeking salvation, adhering to the laws of and aspiring to the territorial expansion of the state, always in competition with other European states, became the primary behavior motivating goal. And the West then came to simultaneously to kind of overrepresent this conception of the man as human as the one and only universal definition of the human, and failing to see its kind of local and cultural specificity, part of this also being the inability to accept other religions or notions of God, for example. The West then institutionally projected the notions of sub-rationality or irrationality onto all other ways of being human, for example, on the lives of Black Africans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And Winter writes, to kind of sum this up, the West would therefore remain unable from then on to conceive of an other to what it calls human, an other therefore to its correlated postulates of power, truth, freedom. All other modes of being human would instead have to be seen not as the alternative modes of being human that they are out there, but adaptively as the lack of the West's ontologically absolute self-description. So Winter argues very persuasively that this self-absorbed and egotistic condition of the West laid the foundations of modernity and justified the Western colonial enterprise with its complex apparatus of violence, which is still in motion today. And obviously, Winter's theorization is just one of many modes of framing what the sensibility of the West is and how it operates. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm relying on Winter's interpretation and consider the West's self-description, as she puts it, simultaneously as a specific historical construct and an abstract, ubiquitous edifice that continues to be reproduced in political, cultural, and everyday practices now. Moving on from Winter, in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, Catherine Yusof traces the connection of what she calls the historiography of the colonial man, as in the man that Winter also talks about, to the notion of the Anthropocene. And Yusof looks into the three historical eras that have been proposed to mark the beginning of the Anthropocene, also known as the three golden spikes. The first one is the European colonial invasion of the Americas, which has also been referred to as the Columbian Exchange, although it wasn't really an exchange. The second is the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, and the 20th century Great Acceleration is the third one, and that's characterized specifically by the rapid development of nuclear technologies. So unpacking how colonial occupation, dispossession, extraction, displacement, and extreme violence is embedded in each and every one of these golden spikes, Yusof stresses that even if the contemporary scientific discourse on the Anthropocene would rather erase this fact, coloniality and anti-Blackness are materially inscribed into the Anthropocene. The attempt to erase this fact is, of course, telling of how the Anthropocene narrative about the origins of ecological decline and climate emergence is built now, informed by present-day politics from the perspective of Western colonialism to designate agency and accountability in a very particular way. And Yusof demonstrates how natural scientific and social scientific Anthropocene narratives are often built to convince colonizer societies of their own innocence. Of course, how convenient. So such narratives suggest that humanity simply hadn't understood the violent ramifications of colonialism, industrialization, and capitalist modes of production, although these violences had actually been intentionally at the very crux of said practices all along. And this denial is accompanied by a proposition that after humanity suddenly realized the full consequences of colonial atrocities, these atrocities swiftly became the thing of the past. However, we continue to exist in a settler colonial present, where colonial modes of subjugation continue to be reproduced in, for example, practices of incarceration, racialized capitalism of the mining industries, and environmental racism. And speaking of like colonial legacies in the present day politics of waste and pollution, for example, Françoise Verger writes in her Efflux article, Capitalocene, Waste, Race and Gender, how after having systematically destroyed non-European cities whose cleanliness they were in awe of, Europeans now maintain the image of their own cleanliness by dumping their waste in the global south. And that's only one instance of things like these being structurally in place. And despite the prevailing circumstances, the dominant Anthropocene narratives, which Yusuf is critiquing, insist that what we should really focus on is the role of the West as the pioneer of building sustainable futures on behalf of the entire planet, again, as the sole holder of power, truth, and freedom. And Yusuf writes to kind of, again, sum this up. This attempt to absolve positionality of Western colonial knowledge and extraction practices, while simultaneously reinforcing and resettling them in a new territory, a Western frontier of pioneers armed with eco-optimism and geoengineering, indicates a desire to overcome coloniality without a corresponding relinquishing of the power it continues to generate in terms of who gets to formulate, implement, and speak to and of the future. And now that I've arrived at this reluctance of Western societies to relinquish their white supremacist, colonial, capitalist modus operandi, I want to recommend to you all a figurative, but also kind of literal journey to space. Artist and musician Hannah Catherine Jones produced a new composition of sound and text and moving image called Ode to Humana for Obsidian Coast last year. It's an online commission. And with this composition, Jones asks, how can we escape from the categorization that privileges Western European monoculture? And as it sets out to map this escape, it traverses the atmosphere with this visual imagery, but also with the script. And yeah, it traverses the atmosphere and it drifts through the whole solar system towards Pluto and the Andromeda galaxy. And on this journey, Jones kind of demonstrates the tentacular reach of this European monoculture that we're trying to get away from, as something that forcefully works to control all time, thought and matter at all times, always at work. But finally, then it brings to focus specific celestial bodies which seem to subvert this colonial rule and sees these celestial bodies as something with which to imagine other ways of being and relating to the world. So if anyone is keen on cosmic travel, the work is currently on the Obsidian Coast website. Moving on. So I've taken some time to think through how the human as a Western construct and a colonial category hasn't allowed all human subjects to occupy the space of humanity equally. And Alexander Wehelier notes in his book Happy as Viscous, which is a deep dive into Black feminist theories of the human, how post-humanist and anti-humanist discourses, which dominate a lot of the critical inquiries at the moment into nature-culture binaries and modern human ecologies, for example, how they fail to appropriately address the exclusive foundations of the human in Western thought. And this shortcoming has allowed said discourses to flippantly call for doing away with the category of the human altogether, even though the notion of humanity is at the crux of ongoing fights for social justice. So Wehelier concludes that giving up on the notion of the human is not an option. Instead, the equivalence of the human with man needs to be displaced by formulating alternative versions of the human. And before I shift gears and start talking about how to include other than human beings and ecologies into our political thought, I want to note, so any considerations of more than human worlds should always happen in parallel with staying attentive to the ongoing work of the human being reconfigured. Also, when we talk about different violences that may be connected but manifest in the lives of humans and non-humans in specific ways, it's important to remain attentive to these distinctions and to the specificity of each struggle. So with this in mind, it feels helpful to briefly visit Mel Chen's writings on animacies. And maybe it's nice to note as well that of Animacy Reading Group was named after Mel Chen's writing on animacies. So Chen digs into this slippery linguistic term animacy, which indicates quality of agency, awareness, mobility, and liveness. And Chen maps out how varying levels of animateness are hierarchically inscribed into different categories of beings and matter in the Western cultural imagination. So Chen interrogates what is deemed or allowed to be animate, how the divisions between animate and inanimate are relentlessly produced and policed, and what happens when transgressions occur and something that shouldn't be animate suddenly becomes so. And they suggest that these divisions between animate and inanimate in themselves are also politically loaded, always connecting to the notions of race, gender, sexuality, ability, and class. And this is to say that Western thought imposes an expectation or a demand even of inertness on anything and everything that diverts from the man with a capital M. And this everything, therefore, doesn't only entail other than human worlds like minerals, plants, or non-human animals, but also specific ways of being human. So this is in line with Winter as well. And in the article Toxic Animacies and Inanimate Affections, Chen probes at the animateness and affect of toxins, specifically heavy metals, whilst recounting how their own everyday encounters and experiences of intimacy are shaped by multiple chemical sensitivity. And alongside these lovely autobiographical accounts of, I mean, they're lovely, written in a lovely way, but not lovely as a thing to experience, of how mercury toxicity affects one's body in unexpected ways when walking down a street, for example. Chen outlines how exposure to specific toxins is determined by hierarchical social structures, and how specific toxins can also become stand-ins or vehicles in the Western cultural imagination, again, for a whole array of xenophobic, ableist, and heterosexist anxieties of the white middle class. So Chen's writing about mercury and lead demonstrates, I think, in a compelling way how even the things that might have been disregarded and entirely lifeless are too loaded with a vibrancy that can exert their force on the material world, thus destabilizing the Western categories of life and subjectivity. And all matter and beings are characterized by their own vibrancy and agency in this way. And as the occupants of our own porous, entangled bodies, we are bound to all these energies and potencies, whether we want to be or not. And this is why reconfiguring our understanding of other than human beings and their inescapable and distinct connections to all ways of being human is a prerequisite for any plausible account of existence and its material conditions here and now. So this feels like a good opportunity to mention Earth Return, an online-based work by Alma Josephine Budge, April Lynn, and Sam Smith. In this work, the trio, working as a collective, mediates the emergence of Mudmind, an extraterrestrial vegetal being reaching for humanity via the internet, precisely to reconfigure our understanding of and position as a constitutive part of complex modern human worlds. And speaking with the array of non-human voices, a lot of it is from Birdsong. Mudmind asks, you're also focused on where we came and how and what it is we want. Is it not enough that we came with eyes open wide to love you despite the horror in your faces, the cruelty, to offer safe passage, sentient proof of another way? For there are always other ways, have ever been other ways. Can you remember them yet? And if you'd like to meet Mudmind and hear their message about decentering the human, which I think the work is essentially about, for me anyway, and they live on a dedicated website on the Art Gallery of New South Wales called Together in Art. So over the last couple of decades, especially this realization that humans aren't the pinnacle of everything has finally dawned on an increasing number of scholars working in Western academia. And this wave of thinkers has multiple frontiers, but many sit comfortably under the umbrella of new materialisms. And to critically address this inbuilt claim of newness, I want to mention Kim Tolbear. Tolbear has critiqued new materialism for how it has systematically excluded any mention of indigenous thought, although indigenous thought has addressed the vibrancy and agency of all matter long before new materialism ever existed as a thing. And to demonstrate the systematic exclusion, she mentions how Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, a book that is a really seminal work on new materialism published in 2010, entails 117 opportunities to reference indigenous thought, but fails to do so even once. And in the context of this critique, Tolbear discusses how Western academia is struggling to find an appropriate language to account for the agency of more than human worlds or other than human worlds, and connects this difficulty with the strict secularity of the Western academia. So again, connecting back to the emergence of physical sciences and secularization. In other words, Western scientific discourse has built a barrier between what can be discussed in the realm of knowledge and what can be, or what should be strictly considered and limited to the realm of belief. And Tolbear suggests that the refusal to consider life in more than a strictly biological sense, or the refusal to accept terms like soul or spirit, for example, limits the language that is available. And this again explains, according to Tolbear, the volume of highly complex and impenetrable academic languages that are now being developed to scientifically describe the agency of non-humans. And having mentioned Tolbear, she recognizes Mel Chen's work on animacies among the most thoughtful and generative works on the vibrancy of more than human worlds in a secular context, and evoking Chen's point about the political hierarchies that are embedded in these Western animate-inanimate divisions. Tolbear summarizes the critique. The invisibility of our ontologies, the very few references to them in their writing, and reference to indigenous thought by other theoretical traditions as beliefs or artifacts of waning time to be studied but not interacted with as truths about the living world. All of this is to deny our vibrancy. It is a denial of ongoing intimate relations between indigenous peoples as well as between us and non-humans in these lands. We are the living that the new materialists, like so many Western thinkers before them and beside them, refuse to see. And I think it's the perfect quote. I think it's beautifully put and very apt. But I think it's nice to also point out that this comes as a follow-up of this very excellent metaphor of talking about this horror film, The Others, where there's this kind of division between life and death, and as someone refuses to see people that are alive in essence. So it's kind of done around this kind of film metaphor, if someone's seen this horror film with Nicole Kidman in it. So now I think I'm ready to move on to more than human worlds. So I've kind of traced the pathway from the history of Western humanism to the vibrancy and agency of all matter and beings. So now I'm kind of picking up on Tolbear's mention of the intimate relationality with non-humans, and through that definitions of sociality. Anna Zing writes in her article More Than Human Sociality that if sociality means to be made in entangling relations with significant others, evidently all beings, in that case human and non-human, are fundamentally social. And focusing on manifestations of plant and mushroom sociality specifically, but also acknowledging social dimensions of rocks and rivers, for example, Zing kind of challenges the assumptions of human exceptionalism in Western philosophy, specifically since the Enlightenment, and examines a range of material conditions under which sociality can occur. It only needs to be recognized as such. And she argues that if humans are endlessly expanding their activities and habitats, causing planned and unplanned disturbances in other than human worlds, we have to be able to understand environmental change. For this to be possible, it's also necessary to understand what kinds of socialities non-humans develop in the absence of human activity, and what kinds of socialities can form between humans and non-humans when humans are present. And Zing explains how Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment philosopher, argued for human exceptionalism, and on these grounds for humans' exclusive ability to be social, with the assumption that only humans enjoy free will, freedom of action, and moral reason. Apparently, these are the criteria for sociality. Other species, again, were framed by Kant as mechanical beings subject to the demands of nature, and therefore incapable of forming meaningful or significant social relations. And delightfully, I think, Zing argues that we must revise what freedom to act actually means. And she demonstrates how all living beings are free to maneuver within these worlds that they and we constitute together. We simply have to do it within the parameters of our bodily form. And where humans with, determinate body structures, we can move from one social context to another. Plants and mushrooms, they grow into new environments and social fields, and their bodily form becomes a record of their biography and social history. And plants and mushrooms, they also purposefully seek the company of the species that they prefer whilst closing off others, which is to say that they're able to change worlds that they inhabit for their benefit. So when you think about it in this way, humans and plants and mushrooms perhaps aren't that different in their socialities after all. The most crucial point I think that Zing makes is that human modes of sociality can no longer be viewed simply as conquest of other species, or as something that exists next to but separate from other than human worlds. Instead, humans are constituents of social worlds in which both humans and non-humans live together. And with this comes the caveat that may be difficult for the Western Enlightenment sensibility to swallow. When we as humans attune to other than human social formations, we're bound to come across endless worlds in which we may try to participate if we're let in at all, but we can never be in charge of them. And having said that, Soderbergh's film Terra Nullius, which is entirely sampled from and rewriting the plot lines of the history of Australian cinema, I think does some of this work of imagining worlds in which the usual Western protagonist is not in charge. And this political revenge tale, or fable as it's been described, also as kind of part political satire, eco-horror and road movie, it makes, for example, the following scenarios possible. Russell Crowe's neo-Nazi character Hando in Romper Stomper gets stabbed in the neck by a vengeful bird, who's probably anti-fascist, right? And one of the most cringe-worthy heroes of cinematic history, Crocodile Dundee, gets eaten by a crocodile after first being shot by Sue Charlton, his companion, for spewing out sexist comments. And a formal gathering to celebrate the Queen's bicentenary speech in Australia gets interrupted by an enormous herd of flesh-eating anti-colonial sheep. And this film has been screened endlessly around the world since it was completed in 2018. But if you are yet to see it, I cannot recommend it enough. It's on Vimeo on demand. You can rent it to view it. So now, as befits Curatorial's, returning to Desprez and Murray's text on cosmoecology, the authors describe how the Mongolian shepherds rely on gazelle-hunting wolves to ensure that the local landscape can provide enough food for their livestock. At the same time, they accept that the wolves may also kill livestock, and occasionally even herders may lose their lives to these wolves. And in similar terms, they discuss the reintroduction of traditional sheep herding practices, specifically in the south of France in this essay, which involve releasing sheep from industrial farms to local grasslands and woodlands. And such practices are not only transforming the lives of the sheep and the shepherds, but also the landscapes in which they roam, and therefore the lives of all the people who kind of also live in those landscapes. Technically, this improves biodiversity, but with very multifaceted consequences. So, for instance, the authors note wild boars struggle to hide from predators in reduced vegetation when sheep go and eat all the green around them. And some birds' nesting habitats are exposed to the dangers of trampling sheep, specifically the ones that nest on the ground. And the authors also note the relationship between the herders and their sheep. So despite the herders' really genuine love and care for their flock, like they take quite a bit of time describing how the herders describe the sheep as beautiful with such love, they are, at the end of the day, they are raising the sheep to be eaten. And this is what is meant by the idea, I think, that all beings are tied together with non-innocent bonds. And at the crux of thinking about our involvement in modern human worlds, I think, for me, the following questions. So what values guide relationships when we effectively eat our own kin? And that's a necessity. And then what is life-affirming care for more than human worlds when life-affirming for one can always be fatal to another? Maria Puig de la Bellacasa writes in her essay, Thinking with Care, where there is relation, there has to be care, but our cares also perform disconnection. We cannot possibly care for everything. Not everything can count in a world. Not everything is relevant in a world. There is no life without some kind of death. And I think when there's this idea of relevance, I think that refers to this, that you have a specific world in which things are relevant to you in a certain way. And then that world overlaps with other things that are still kind of intermingled with your world, but it's not a concern to you, if that makes sense. And this rule that there's always some kind of death with any occasion of life, it applies whenever humans assume the role of a custodian to preserve or restore a particular ecosystem. It means that conscious decisions are made about which life forms are protected, and often at the expense of others. Hence, the mundane yet very diligent processes of care are also wrapped up in these urgent matters of life and death. So in line with this insistence that care is always connected to conflict, dissension, and these non-innocent bonds, I want to mention artist Sonia Levy's film For the Love of Corals. The film follows a coral reproductive research in the basement of the Honeymoon Museum in London, where a team of scientists has been the first in the world to breed corals in captivity by simulating the conditions of the Great Barrier Reef. And the aim of this research is to resuscitate coral species from their human-induced extinction, but at the same time, keeping the corals in captivity is the fundamental condition of this work. So Sonia examines the complications of human custodianship, specifically how a museum, which very much echoes the Enlightenment values of human mastery over nature, can function as a base for this collaborative multi-species survival endeavor. And the project also ignites discussion about extinction in general, I think. And Despair in this same article that I've been referring to, they suggest that extinction is not so much about whether there are individuals of a certain species left, but whether a certain species is still able to live and build worlds in relation to other beings with its own species-specific ways. So is extinction then above all the death of a world of some kind? And maybe something to also note about Sonja's work is that there's also a very conscious attempt to produce images carefully in a way that don't perhaps sensationalize or fetishize non-humans. And that's maybe another conversation in itself, but I think it's important to say that that's a kind of conscious consideration in Sonja's work, I think. So then moving on to an obligation to act. Astrida Neymanis writes in her essay, No Representation Without Colonization, or Nature Represents Itself, about the Western colonial dimensions of assigning oneself to the task of protecting and saving more than human worlds. And she traces through material feminist, anti-colonial, and eco-feminist writings to articulate how whenever we seek to advocate for the interests of others or address injustices done unto others, there is a risk of violence embedded in the attempt of speaking on someone's behalf. And at the same time, she admits that the stakes are simply too high to be silent or to do nothing at all. And this heightened awareness of one's ethico-political positioning echoes, and may be familiar to many from the context of anti-colonial and feminist critiques, for example. And when brought into the context of modern human relations, it's complicated by the absence of shared systems of representation like language, and therefore the impossibility of affirmative consent. As in, how can we get affirmative consent that what we're about to do to, I don't know, address injustices done unto them? How do we get this affirmative consent that what we're about to do is okay? And rather than seeking to kind of free us from this ethico-political complexity in the context of more than human will specifically, Neymanis is stressing that sometimes we must make imperfect choices. When we feel compelled or obligated by our other than human kins to act, we must respond to this obligation with sensitivity to the risks involved, whilst remaining accountable for the choices we make. So this is where I want to close the circle and return to the term cosmoecology. So Despair and Marais summarize in their article, this is the true meaning of cosmoecology, other ways of being obligated by those to whom you give the power to obligate you. What affects you, and whom does your way of living, your manner of being, affect in turn? This is, in other words, experimental cosmoecology, learning to hold possibilities open, learning attentiveness to the infinite ways of being affected and of affecting, when no one may know ahead of time the effects one is capable of, or the kinds of forces and entities that will constitute landscapes and worlds with us. And this is, I guess, the crux of everything for me, that this inescapable uncertainty of these far-reaching consequences of our actions and the inability to ever know what exactly is the right thing to do can easily become a source of anxiety and grief, to the extent that it might be difficult to do anything at all. But these, at the same time, these uncomfortable affects are nothing more than the inevitable companion of attuning to the conflicting needs of this collective cosmoecological body that we share. And perhaps the point is not so much to find definitive answers, but rather to stay with the questions whilst doing the best that you can. And I've now come to the end of the talk, but after talking about the difficulty of doing anything at all, I want to briefly return to Empty Metal. To recap, the film has these underground insurrectionaries who are recruiting politically disaffected individuals to assassinate figures of state power. Empty Metal, I think, directly taps into the question of what one is to do to dismantle a ubiquitous infrastructure built upon extreme injustice and violence. And it plays out a speculative scenario of what one might indeed do. And the scenario could be seen as pretty outrageous, but it critically examines the weight and potential, or also futility, of individual action in the face of systemic injustice. And it also taps into how the state can routinely subject civilians to violence while civilians can't even discuss, let alone consider, the possibility of violence towards the state. And I think it's exactly this taboo around militancy in the context of fighting for social justice that may make the film feel quite extreme. But instead of literally inciting violence, I think the film does something more nuanced and interesting. So the noise band who gets recruited to assassinate these white police officers, their disillusionment is primarily connected to the question of whether simply producing art is enough of a political contribution to society. And even the film tagline reads, "Do you really just want to be part of a band anymore?" However, I think at the same time, Empty Metal itself as an artistic product connects with the dimension of filmmaking as a truly potent political instrument, and gifting the conviction of these activist spirits whose power emanates through the screen, to me anyway. It injects its viewer with the faith in collective organizing and in the possibility of finding meaningful political action, and even under circumstances that feel insurmountable. And as a parting gift, as the final thing that I will do now, for anyone who has ever felt that there is nothing to be done in the face of a planetary disaster, I want to pass on the film's final monologue, and I think we're going to play it now.
We fall deeper and deeper into the habit of regarding the evolution of culture as something that will progress or regress no matter what we do. People with the agency and the freedom of privacy to flip the status quo attempt to do so without realizing the magic of the mind. People without these privileges have no choice but to realize this magic. In other words, those who truly know humans are the ones who need help. Those who can help do so without knowing humans. What must occur is an apocalypse. There exists a nucleus of people who, if they set themselves to the task, whether they know it already or not, are capable of revealing a seminal idea of maintained urgency, an invisible insurrection until everyone is free. It's never them, always you. This willful manifestation of an alternative reality will allow and depend on a forging of impossible alliances, a scrambling of stereotypes. It will be a gradual transition of necessity, more complex and diffuse than any physical war, yet more unnerving than the changing seasons. We must discard this paralytic posture and seize control of the human process by assuming control of ourselves. We must deconstruct ourselves and isolate every useful part of our beings and own that value. We must reject the conventional fiction of unchanging human nature. There is, in fact, no such permanence anywhere.
Thank you, Nella. It's really interesting to hear the critical and artistic thought that you're so invested in, and that kind of guides, I guess, both your practice and life at large. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. Lots to think about and take into account. I was wondering if we could jump into some questions, if that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I wanted to start with talking about Obsidian Coast, which is the art space that you're co-director of, and maybe how this relates to what you've been talking about today. It's described as a space for unhurried artistic and curatorial practice. Could you tell us a bit about this notion of the unhurried practice? Because I found it an interesting description, and I wondered if it was maybe a kind of like a manifestation of the heightened sensitivity and care that you've kind of talked about today. Like, is it a space that kind of foregrounds the critical thought that you've kind of explored for us today?
Yeah, I think definitely all of these things that I've kind of brought together today, they are always, I realize now, they've been informing everything that I've thought about and done for a long time. Obviously, it's very difficult to kind of manifest these things in intangible ways, but in relation to Obsidian Coast, and especially this idea of unhurriedness, we always thought about sustainability in many different ways, in terms of just thinking about all kinds of capacity, like psychological, temporal, financial, environmental, all kinds of capacities are at play when we talk about sustainability. And I think we want to do something where we feel like we can take the care with everything that we do, and rather than being forced into this kind of I guess there's this kind of treadmill of accelerated production that we also, the art world is kind of not exempt from, I think, and a lot of organizations are under a lot of pressure to be kind of demonstrating constant growth of a kind of participant and audience numbers, and you always have to scale up and you always have to kind of justify your existence by doing more and more ambitious things with less resources in a way. There's this kind of I think it's quite an exhaustive path to be on. So we try to think about all those things, and then also I think those questions also relate to how you work with other people, how you form relationships with, say, artists that we bring in and we engage with, and what kinds of opportunities we make available. Like also thinking about residencies that we do, rather than kind of forcing people to kind of produce something at the end of a residency and having these kind of intensive 3-month periods or something like this. We can have someone return for multiple visits over, a longer period of time when they can take time off work, and, it's more sustainable for them to do so. But then obviously we also want to think about this, in relation to international travel, and there's like so many things to consider, but they're always kind of at play. And I think similarly, these considerations, they feed into the kinds of ideas that we want to explore in our programming, or also, kind of find the people who've got similar interests or maybe political alignments, and find these opportunities to also then make long-term friendships with everyone that we engage with. So there's a lot going on, and also it's connected to a kind of domestic space. So then there's also that kind of bringing, because we live upstairs of Obsidian Coast, and I'm in the OC office right now. So there's also that kind of opening our home, and therefore also functioning in a slightly different way when people come for residencies, for example. So yeah, there's a lot going on about kind of care and intimacy and boundaries and different kinds of perhaps ethical dynamics and how we establish encounters in various different directions in different contexts. So yeah, that's a bit of a tangent kind of answer, but yeah.
Yeah, because you the space is like envisaged as a mythical coast, right? Is it kind of coastal ecosystem, like as a metaphor for how it operates, which I think is quite a nice idea.
Yeah, and I think the residencies, maybe they demonstrate it quite nicely as well, that when people come, obviously also people who do, for instance, an exhibition with us and hasn't necessarily done like a formal residency, but anyone who comes and stays with us, there's this kind of, our kind of daily lives, they kind of collide. And usually when someone has been here and then they leave, there's something that we keep forever in our lives because that someone's been here, whether they found a new walking path that we're going to start going on a regular basis, or they cook some food that we find ourselves eating again and again. So there's always this kind of, you pick up these little things, and the kind of our lives evolve with every person that kind of passes through, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, well, for people who aren't familiar with Obsidian Coast, I do really recommend you go check them out, because they've got a really great program. I was thinking it was interesting hearing you speak today, because it brought to mind a conversation that we had with an artist as part of this program, actually, Tima Sitchin. And we were recording a podcast with him the other week, and he was saying that, at this time of ecological decline, what was needed in the West was kind of like a shift away from the very deeply embedded dualistic way of thinking. So nature versus culture, living, non-living, human, non-human, things like this. And towards what he called a spirituality of symbiosis, I guess a more non-dualistic approach that I think feels like it rings true with maybe what we were talking about today, in relation to attuning to vibrancy and the common matter of all things. And I guess I was just wondering that if you felt, optimistic that this shift in thinking, away from human exceptionalism, that maybe both you and people like Tima are kind of advocating for, that this could maybe take hold across a wider collective consciousness in the West.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's a big one, no? Yeah, I think if I'm super frank, I think it's hard to feel optimistic per se. I totally I understand what you're saying, that there's all this thought out there and it's available to anyone to find. And I think there's also maybe there is increasing interest in these kinds of questions and in interrogations, if you will. And I think that there is potential, but at the same time, I feel like we're so far away from that kind of tangibly happening, because at the end of the day, there's so much about it is systemic, and the kind of system that has been constructed that everyone's lives now literally depend on. When you think about production of food, or those supermarkets, and this kind of all these industries that kind of keep us how we are and keep us essentially alive, and different kinds of how services are provided that are kind of essential to a lot of people. I think the way that they are organized or are not organized, they're so few people are holding the strings, and it's done in a very specific way to benefit a few without any consequences of or without consideration of any long-term consequences, or also kind of consequences beyond the kind of human realm. It's difficult to kind of see how you could ever grab someone like that and shake them into thinking otherwise. But then at the same time, there's this, which is why I like empty metal so much, is that there is this kind of proposition of this kind of small nucleus of people, as is kind of mentioned in the final monologue, that there is this kind of insurmountable kind of situation, but that there is some kind of possibility there, and this is not the time to throw in the towel. And that, I don't know, I think there's something maybe to be said about extreme measures as well, but maybe I don't want to go there, because I don't want anyone to get I don't want anyone to get a wrong impression of how politically extreme I am. But anyway, yeah, it's difficult to be optimistic, but I think it's important to be hopeful. And I think those things that you talk about exactly, and this idea of everything being connected, it has been articulated in many ways, and there's that kind of spiritual view of it, but there are also other I guess that's also kind of referring back to Kim Tolbe talking about these impenetrable academic languages, and there are many ways that it's been articulated in different places. So there's definitely that kind of work happening, and it's out there. And I think I wish that more people, and the people with the with the capacity to do something would engage with them. But yeah, we'll see how it serves their interests, right?
Yeah. I mean, maybe that leads quite nicely onto a question from the audience. What small steps can we take in our daily lives to take action or responsibility for our impact on the planet and mending the bridge between the human and the non-human?
Wow.
Again, you're just getting all the big questions.
I feel like there are so many steps, but I think this is what's tricky, because often when we talked about these things, even when you look at the David Attenborough documentaries or what have you, there's often this kind of call on the individual to do something by themselves as this kind of sole agent to go about and change the world by recycling the rubbish, And I think that's maybe a little. I mean, it's not enough, because the problems that we're dealing with, they're so vast, and they are on a planetary scale, and they are systemic. So really, they should be dealt with on an infrastructural level. I'm not saying that you shouldn't think about anything at all. Of course you can, but I think we're also dealing, when we think about these things, we're also dealing with a lot of guilt and anxiety and the kind of grief and sorrow that I talked about, that, you don't even feel like you can go to the supermarket and buy a tomato without already then being kind of implicated in these kind of production chains that you are then supporting. I was just listening to a podcast today where these two lovely kind of left-wing feminists, Finnish people, they were talking about how cinnamon is ruined, and they were talking about this kind of notion of all the kind of production lines of cinnamon as how it ends up as a product, as a spice into our kitchen cupboards. And they were dealing with exactly this question of how should you then give up cinnamon? Should you stop buying cinnamon? Should you stop cooking with cinnamon? What does it do? But then at the end of the day, really, where the change needs to happen is at the kind of at the source rather than at the end point, So I think there are some things we can do. I mean, I try not to fly or travel unnecessarily and all these kinds of things, and they're very easy. But then, yeah, I wouldn't I would never expect an individual to solve this giant problem that we're kind of facing. And I think there are many ways, endless ways that you could kind of deal with some of that anxiety that you may be feeling as an individual, to feel like you're somehow engaging. And I think the number one thing to do, I guess, is to be as aware of these things as possible, of the kinds of production chains that you are perhaps contributing to or maintaining with your actions, and just kind of be aware and then make the choices where you can, and also maybe choose your battles in a way that's most sustainable to you. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, as you said earlier, it's this sort of chaotic web that can kind of feel sometimes maybe a bit overwhelming to some people, I guess. Returning to this thought about kind of shift in Western thinking, I guess I was interested in asking also how you perceive art as a tool to play a role within that sort of shift, and maybe away from human exceptionalism towards sort of ways of thinking that you've been talking about today. And I know you touched on that a bit in relation to the film Empty Metal, and how you felt the film was kind of a potent political instrument.
Yeah, it's interesting, this one. I feel like there are so many ongoing conversations. I mean, it's been going on for decades. Is art political, and should it be political? And if it is political, what can it actually achieve? And there are many kind of conflated kind of questions in this realm. I think the reason why I'm involved in contemporary art, if that's maybe a really weird thing to say, is I guess that I realized that by engaging with artistic practices, that was for me a way to tune into a lot of things that I might not even kind of understand that it existed in the first place. So it is this kind of, it is a really excellent, I think, a way to, in a kind of more complex way than say a David Attenborough documentary can do, to kind of open up different lines of inquiry in a critical way without necessarily giving these kind of straight up answers, because there aren't one fits all answers to any of this ever, I would argue anyway. And I think, yeah, the kinds of works that I maybe mentioned today as well, I think they all do something different. And I think all of those things are very generative, but in different ways, whether it's a kind of, like I feel like this idea of this mud mind, this extraterrestrial being that comes and kind of tries to communicate something, that's a way to kind of more abstractly maybe think about exactly these ways of thinking that have been established and how to maybe imagine otherwise, how to think otherwise. And I think Hannah Catherine Jones does a similar thing in this idea of kind of pulling, like zooming out and going into space and looking for inspiration from celestial bodies, because literally white supremacy is everywhere.
Yeah.
So there are these kind of, it's a good opener for these things. But then there's also this, like you were saying, in terms of empty metal too, there is this idea of the kind of, I guess like a privileged kind of a liberal art student who is in a band and thinks that that's going to do something, and then they realize that maybe it won't. So there is that tension there always, and I think that resonates with me too. Like I'm sometimes thinking, what is this for, and who am I speaking to, and who's going to see Obsidian Coast programming? There are all these questions kind of ongoing, and I think it's good to be aware of them and kind of critical of that. But then that's, again, maybe not a reason to, again, like not engage in that realm, because it's not like a, I think the fact that it doesn't resonate with everyone is precisely because it is nuanced and complicated, because that's what art has the kind of allowance to be. Whereas if you run like an activist campaign, it has to be more direct, like Extinction Rebellion needs to be able to kind of bring in these masses, right? So I think they're just different mechanisms, and I think they're equally worthwhile as things. And I think, empty metal is particularly, I think, potent in how it kind of also then how that also has found its way into kind of mainstream audience, even though it's quite out there through, Amazon Prime, for instance. He was there for a while.
I've just got kind of one eye on the time. I think we might have to kind of start wrapping up. Wish we could kind of had a chance to talk about those vengeful anti-fascist birds and anti-colonial sheep, but I think we might have to bring it to a close there. But just want to say thank you so much for your time today, and it's really interesting hearing you speak. And thank you for everyone else who tuned in. So
thank you.
Cool.
Cool.
Take care.
Cool. Thank you.